These homes in Colonial Williamsburg, we discovered, were rebuilt in the 1920s, mostly because John Rockefeller Jr. slowly bought up a lot of the property here that was not built up at the time, but had to be discovered by digging up the foundations to find out where the original structures lay. So after John Rockefeller Jr. purchased and financed the project, Colonial Williamsburg was rebuilt, and here we are today. Or these homes, 100 years later now, they're still standing. Okay, so this Colonial Williamsburg, we found out that it was rebuilt in the 1920s, and down at the end of the street there's an Anglican church, and the bishop of that church was Bishop Goodwin. And so the pastor Goodwin of the church here on this street called the Duke of Gloucester Street, he had a burden for this place because all the buildings were dilapidated and breaking down, and the bishop of the church really had no finances to try to rebuild the city. And so he began to look for donations and look for those who had an interest to rebuild Williamsburg, the old capital of Virginia. So then he found one woman named Abby Aldrich who helped out, and then one John Rockefeller Jr. who had a great burden to rebuild this city. And so together they hired archaeologists, they hired builders, and they rebuilt what you see before you. The buildings you see behind me were built about 100 years ago in 1920. And so we're so thankful that we get to walk through history and to see it still preserved 100 years later, representing something from 400 years ago. So what a joy, what a treasure it is. And we're so thankful, what a joy it is to walk through history and to see the benefits that we've received because we're a part of America. We're a blessed people if we've been raised in America, receive the benefits of the freedoms of America, the benefits of democracy and representative government. And we're a flawed people. There's nuance in history where mistakes have been made, but one genius of the American government is that it was formed to make a more perfect union. See, knowing that we're not perfect, but if we write documents that can lead us to a more perfect union of freedom and equality for all people, then we can push towards that perfection as we look at the face of God, that God is perfect and we are not, and we can look at the love of God and the justice of God and try to reflect His nature and form a more perfect union. And so standing behind me is the Capitol building that was built in 1705, was really the first form of government for Virginia after Jamestown. And the Virginia House of Burgesses met there to represent the people of Virginia. And so this was really the center of this new American colony that soon became independent from Britain to create a revolution for democracy, for freedom, for equality. And being imperfect as they were, they made mistakes of not giving freedom to the Africans, not giving freedom to the Indians, but that came later because we were pursuing that true equality, that true democracy, that true image of God, because all people are created by God and we are equal and we're born free. And those are things that we discover as we keep following God to God's perfection.
How did you get started in this kind of thing?
I did all sorts of things before I came to work here. Did some construction, security work, a bunch of other things. And I saw the position of state home
Okay, honey, FDR said that this street is the most historic street in America.
Yeah, the most historic neighborhood.
Yeah.
This same street,
Yeah.
George and Martha Washington walked down, Queen Elizabeth, Thomas Jefferson,
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, and even many more
Yeah.
historic people through America's history. They have walked this street and they have had the same dream and passion for our country. That God would bless it.
Yes. Well, sweetheart, you're one of the most beautiful daughters of our nation of America. And our founding fathers would be proud of you.
Oh.
One more thing we learned here in Williamsburg as we were walking through the Capitol, we met George Mason and Patrick Henry is around here. We learned that the people of Virginia understood the western part of the country, like Kentucky and Tennessee. That was all Western Virginia. That's all Virginia. And then when they thought of the North, jokingly, they thought of, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, really as Northern Virginia, because when the Virginia Company was first sent here from England, the whole of America was called Virginia. And so that's why their seat of government here that was established in 1699 here in Williamsburg was really the seat of government for the whole nation before the colonies began to get their own identity. And later in the 1700s, each state developed its own constitutions, and each state began to develop its own government and its own capitals. But the capital here in Williamsburg was really the first and the most used as an example. And so during the 1700s, the capital was soon moved to Richmond, Virginia, further inland. And so this city of Williamsburg enjoyed a certain youth of the nation and was born here.
If there's anything that I might assist you with or point you to, I should be happy to do so. Closest one might be at the Raleigh Tavern, the bakery behind it.
The bakery.
You have a dog that does not bite with no teeth. What happens if a robber breaks into your home? Is that a better dog?
In that scenario, it would be a horse dog.
Quite right. And thus is what we have done here with the Virginia executive. The governor is very, very weak. But I imagine that there may be circumstances in our future where we see that we have just taken the teeth out of our dog. And when, say, a British Royal Navy comes to our shores, we will rather wish we had a dog that still knew how to bite. So I like your idea of the equal, but with a set of checks upon themselves. Although I would counter to you the question of the purpose of a judicial and what its role might be. If you have a strong judicial at a federal level, then what shall be the purpose of the state's judicial?
You want a strong state
It's an interesting analogy to compare state rights versus federal rights.
A curious thing, although it was my guess that the young man was venturing into a time a little bit ahead of 1776, and since, sir, I can answer the question, I did not wish to rob him of that answer, even if I had to go a bit in a more circuitous route to get there.
So you might say that you played your trump card.
I play, yes, sir, I have a great many of those.
Inside that capitol that was built in 1705, we spent some time in the House of Burgesses. So in that room of the House of Burgesses where elected officials will decide the government of Virginia. And the House of Burgesses are the elected officials, but they have to give recommendations to the council. And the council is appointed by the Crown in England. And then the governor of Virginia is also appointed by the Crown in England. And so the true government is being run from the Crown in England, but then we have the House of Burgesses are the people's representative. And as we were inside the Capitol, we walked outside and we started walking towards this house here. This is the Charlton House Tavern. And we got to meet George Mason here. in the backyard, he did a presentation, and George Mason, he described what life was like in 1776, because George Mason was one of the Virginia Burgesses, and he wrote and penned the Virginia Bill of Rights even before it was later put into the Constitution of the United States of America to become the Bill of Rights. And so George Mason is one of the founding fathers because of the documents that he produced within the Virginia Bill of Rights. And he was against slavery, and he was for freedom for all people. And so he was a great example. He himself said today that he's a flawed man and made mistakes, but that's the beauty of America, the beauty of all nations' histories, is that they're made up of flawed people, and we're not to expect them to be perfect. But the key thing about America, in the document of our founders, it says that we are resolved to create this country a more perfect union. That means we're not perfect, but we want to be more perfect. And so that's a great reflection today.
Here and now, in this year of 1776, first here in Virginia, we have made a call for independence from our mother country. Do you know, well, what happened there on the 15th of May in that building, just across the way? Are you familiar?
Yes.
Some, yes. Others, look at me, facing stairs, oppressed in the heat, I well know. It was there on the 15th of May, voted for the first time ever, that a representative be sent to that Congress of Philadelphia with instructions to recommend to that respectable body to declare these united colonies free and independent states, absolved of all allegiance to and dependence upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. Okay. Yeah! Woo! Well enough, yeah. Something that was celebrated here in the city for 3 days. And I know some of you hesitate to applaud. You say, Colonel Mason, that was not the first talk of independency, or even the first declaration. There's been independent companies taking up arms against the king's troops who declared them independent, separate from a king. There have been counties so united in their opinions that they themselves have declared themselves independent, no longer dependent upon the king. I have even heard talk that some colonies themselves had discussed independency. Though the only one that comes to mind at present is Rhode Island. I do not know whether she constitutes much more than a county anyways. No, what was the difference? It were a united independency, alongside of our brothers and sisters, decided upon not by Virginia, or Massachusetts, or Pennsylvania, but these united colonies. This is a frightening consideration. How long in our lives have we considered those of other colonies so very different from ourselves? Differing backgrounds, differing histories, differing occupations, differing philosophies, differing religions. And yet, here now we must come united. Once again, if we were not the same person we were yesterday or the day before, what are we working toward? If we recognize that we are constantly in movement, are we doing so for the better or for the worse? Is it progress or recess that we find ourselves in?
Progress.
Progress, one is to hope. But how might we insist upon such things? How might we declare a united independency, lest we know what that independency might entail? What ways are we united with our brothers and sisters from those other colonies? And so though they celebrated for 3 days, only ceasing, I believe, because they had run out of rum punch here in the city. After that May 15th, something else happened that day that I personally think is far more significant. For Virginia had sent a representative that they might vote upon that united independency, but so too that self-same day it was declared that a declaration of our rights and a constitution be created. Well, we well know if you're going to cast off the old, what must you do?
Create new.
There we have an opportunity to show what this independency may be, to give a soul to this call. And though we could only do so for Virginia, might we not lead by example? Might we not create something that stirs the hearts of men, not just here in Virginia, but of Pennsylvania, of New York, of London, or Paris? And thus, upon that day, a committee was called for. Now, I must confess, I were not there that day. Smart could have got Bethany at home for some days. I arrived some 3 days later, immediately appointed to committee, that committee charged with the creation. I have a curiosity for those here present. How many here, by show of hand, have ever sat upon committee before? One's chuckling, already sympathized with me. Even the children, have you ever worked within a group on some project in your schooling? Oh yes, the children may be familiar with this. For those of you who are familiar with our conventions or have sat upon committee before, you will be unsurprised to hear that that particular collection of men was, as is our custom, overcharged with useless members. Now mind you, this was not due to the uselessness of any one or two particular individuals, necessarily. I had not opportunity to meet all of the gentlemen, and the laws of nature insist that wherever at least two politicians may be gathered, them, one must be useless. No. It were not the integrity of the men. Let's face it, there were even still one Judas amongst the apostles, and yet still, it were not the integrity, for there were a great many men whose country's interests were first in their hearts, but it were instead the sin of its sheer size. Now, admittedly, I'm a man who has already confessed a preference for silence and solitude. It will be unsurprising to hear that I would have preferred a smaller collection or company of individuals for this. I needing some 3 men, perhaps. Looking out, though, knowing that we are of a multitude of minds, and recognizing that we wish not to immediately fall upon another monarch here, but instead, the committee for its purpose is to take the best of a collection of individuals, and there are those who are of differing opinions, of also acknowledge I am a man of little fame. The name of George Mason is spoken about in only but a few small circles, though it seems to be growing. Even in the circles in which I am discussed, I know my reputation. I have a curiosity here. How many here have heard the name George Mason before? Well, goodness me, more than I would like. Well, for those of you who have heard of me, I know what you have heard. I know what my political adversaries say of me. They say that George Mason is short in temper, that George Mason is sour in company, that George Mason is curmudgeonly in demeanor, that George Mason is altogether an unsociable creature. Now please understand, all of this which is said about me is
True.
It is true, yes. Yeah. But it is not the entirety of the truth. Now is it? We are not but one aspect of ourselves. I put it to you. Are you the same person you were when you woke up this morning? No answer to that. I shall make it a bit easier. Are you the same person you were when you woke up a week ago?
No.
No. Probably. What about, do you think you were the same person you were a month ago?
Yes.
No. A year ago?
Yes.
No. Here in this summer of 1776, this hot June day of, what is it now, the 29th? 29th of June, 1776. It is quite apparent that we are not the same people we were when we woke up some time ago. And so I should say to you, yes, I may be short in temper, and the topic is not of my liking. I do not suffer fools easily, and thus it is proven that there are a great many fools out there. But that is not the only. When I'm in my home, I'm welcome. When I'm amongst friends, I'm warm. To my family, I'm loving. We must recognize that we are always at odds with ourselves, with the world around us. It is that we might choose the better. It is my own son who has described me, when being asked, as jocular and unbending. If my own son may see both sides in me, I should hope that you will be welcoming to see the other side. And thus, if we are to spend the next
This stage, you're coming to realize that everything about this building is meant to remind you that you are British, and therefore you are subjects of the crown. That is why there is so much monarchy, even here within the elected room. King George II, his wife Queen Caroline. Now, I mentioned outside when we talk about the story of independence here. In this story, these two don't matter except they are his grandparents. That is King George III, and that is his wife. All that is required of you is to just enjoy the tour. Second, please feel free to take any pictures or video you might want to inside. I just ask if you could please silence your devices, and also do please refrain from using any flash photography. Third, feel free to ask any questions during the course of this tour that you might have. There's going to be a lot of big ideas that we're going to talk about here, and I will also endeavor to leave time at the end of the tour. That way, if we, for whatever reason, run out of time for your question inside, or you just don't like asking questions in front of big groups of people, I'll make my...
Okay, now we're in Colonial Williamsburg, and this is our first stop next to the Presbyterian Meeting House and near the first U.S. Capitol, or the first Virginia Capitol.
Virginia.
So we're near the first Virginia Capitol. From 1699, they established it here. So a lot of these old buildings are so beautiful, honey.
Yeah.
Across the street, they said this is George Washington's favorite place to go get food.
Christiana
What's it called?
Campbell's Tavern.
Christiana Campbell's Tavern, right there. George Washington used to get lunch there. So, but we're not hungry for lunch. We want to see history. So let's go walk forward.
Video camera?
So this is the property of John Custis IV, who owned this property back in the 1600s. So John Custis IV was the father of John V, who was the first husband of Martha Washington. So behind me, they're excavating homes that were built in the 1600s with John Custis IV, and he was the father-in-law of Martha Washington when she had her first husband, John Custis V. So, and what were you saying? He was a real stubborn husband that what?
Yeah. They had to make articles of arrangements to be married.
Oh, really?
Yes. In the 1700s.
Okay. Well, when you study people in history, like here in Colonial Williamsburg, you find out that people were not all good, and people also were not all bad. So people are nuanced. That's what you learn here in the South.
Did you learn it in the North too?
Well, in the North, they were all good. But we're here in Virginia. So this is Colonial Williamsburg, and now we're going to go take a tour of the old town. So now we'll show you some of the pictures and the great treasures that they preserved from the 1600s and the 1700s, when America was just a colony of Britain. What do you think, honey?
I think let's go.
All right.